A 10 out of 10 JRPG, the bar we use to measure all other games against. Now for me, there is no such thing as a flawless game, even a masterpiece isn't infallible. But in my eyes, what gives a game that status is that its drawbacks, despite existing, don't take away from the overall experience. With that in mind, I have my own list of 10 out of 10 games, of which I will only use one per franchise, and in no particular order, here they are. And we'll start with potentially the most obvious one in Persona 5 Royal. It currently sits at a whopping 95 out of 100 on Metacritic, and I can't argue with the praise it gets. It was the first Persona game I played, and was the perfect introduction to one of Atlus's pillar franchises. You'd struggle to find many games that top this one from first impression alone. We're not even, 1 minute in and we're jumping through rafters, fighting off weird horse guards and doing all the mad stuff you'd expect of a vigilante of justice. And it doesn't take long to realise that this first impression is not just on the surface. The game oozes style, from the character portraits to the battles, even to the menus. And the soundtrack has to be highlighted too, drawing on a jazzy alternate rock armada of melodies, and it fits like a glove. It ramps up the decibel in those high octane moments like the start of the game, and then tones it down when you're chilling at home base or walking around the city. Hanging out at Café LeBlanc in between missions was always a welcome change of pace, especially when you have these beats to nod off to. Now, for a fair chunk of the game, you're reliving the life of Joker up till his interrogation at the start of the game, where you play out a double life between student and Phantom Thief. The game splits itself into intervals of time, where the player is free to partake in various activities, and this repeats from day to day, separated by a calendar as time passes. The social sim aspect is on full display here, as you partake in a bunch of recreational activities to get the protag up to snuff. Joker has 5 parameters which he can improve over the course of the game, and each activity you do will contribute to one or several of these facets. You're going to be working part-time jobs, doing crosswords, watching movies, playing games within a game, freaky, and improving your relationships with your confidants, which undoubtedly are another highlight of the game. I'd say most of these characters were endearing, relatable, multi-dimensional, and they evolved in line with the events happening around them. They're a real joy to interact with, both inside and outside the main group, and brought to life further with stellar voice work. Now, you're spending a lot of time doing this during your quote normal days, but you'll also be coming together as the Phantom Thieves to partake in the other major part of the game. As events unfold in the real world, you'll eventually be given the chance to infiltrate a so-called palace, which is a manifestation of an individual's distorted desires. The aim as Persona users is to steal their heart and thus make them confess their crimes. I will say immediately, the setup for these palaces is excellent. The Phantom Thieves themselves, especially at the start, are not biting at the ankle to forcibly change a heart, as it raises morality issues that are drawn on a lot during the game. But as these events surrounding the target continue to coalesce, it ramps up the justification that infiltrating their palace is the only way to enact change. Now, I'm normally a stickler for JRPG dungeons. I'm just resigned to the fact that the majority of the time they're gonna suck. They may look pretty, but they're just linear hallways for the most part, with a boss at the end and some story sequences in between. And I've no doubt that one reason why I look at them even more harshly nowadays is because of Persona 5 Royal, for it shows how good this aspect of a game can be. Multiple levels, creative puzzles, rewards for exploration, it has it all. These palaces, dungeons, whatever you want to call them, were stellar near on all the way through, except for mementos which can burn in my subconscious incinerator. It also blurs the line between reality and the palace itself, as there will be moments where you will be forced to return to the real world in order to overcome an obstacle in the palace itself. It's really cool as a concept, and in the majority is executed even better. Of course, there's also the small matter of combat, a turn-based system that is as gratifying as it is strong in foundation. The idea is to capitalise on an enemy's weakness to ensure mostly that you finish the enemy off before they get a chance to retaliate. That is just the foundation though. There are a lot of other mechanics that get added in as you go, and thus if you're not paying attention, you're gonna get destroyed. Not at the level of, say, an SMT game, but it's definitely unforgiving at points. Enemies in this game can wipe you out as easily as you do them, so you need to make sure you're thinking proactively for some of the harder fights. I'd say the only real issue of the combat comes mostly in the boss fights. They're fine for the most part though. I don't think they synchronise completely with the mechanics on offer, or in some cases they will require you to use a certain mechanic to overcome the fight, one that, up till that point, was mostly inconsequential. I concede that Persona 5 Royal has one of my most hated boss fights ever devised in Okamura, which does take away a little, but it's such a small part of the game that it doesn't degrade the overall experience. Persona 5 Royal is a certified masterpiece that you can sink countless hours into, the game that introduced many to JRPGs as a genre, and it's well deserving of its 10 out of 10 status. As is the next entry in Lost Odyssey, which sadly remains in purgatory on the Xbox 360. Come on lads, you can port this over, surely. I believe it can also be played on Xbox One through backwards compatibility, but you still need the discs in order to do that. I can only imagine its lack of ports come down to two main reasons: licensing issues, and the fact that Mistwalker now focus more on mobile titles than console releases. Like Blue Dragon, it seems hope is lost for Lost Odyssey ever coming to even PC despite cross-platform play in the present age. And its Metacritic score might be a window as to why Mistwalker may feel it wouldn't be worth the effort, sitting at around 78 out of 100, which is crazy low in my eyes. Coming out on a platform that just wasn't owned by many JRPG fans was one nail in the coffin, and the traditional old school JRPG as a concept wasn't as popular back in 2007 to 2008 when it first released. Of course, since that point there has been a resurgence, and I'm certain that if Lost Odyssey released now, it would be met with applause and admiration. Initially, its gameplay is going to look familiar to fans of Shadow Hearts, which isn't surprising considering some alumni who worked on that series also worked on Lost Odyssey. It's a typical turn-based battle system with melee attacks, spells and buffs, but also incorporates a ring system to increase the potency of an action. A small addition that ensures the turn-based combat and strategy remain at the forefront of its design, but also adds a little extra to set itself apart. With up to 5 members in combat at any time, along with a front and back row, there's a strong level of customization as the front row acts as a wall to protect the back. But also there is a distinct split between mortals who gain skills via the traditional method of leveling up, and immortals who will learn skills by linking with a mortal character. It's a gratifying system that is paired with a challenging curve of battles too as the story progresses, ensuring that the player is always on edge. But the real highlight of Lost Odyssey for me will always be its stellar story and cast of characters. It's a genuine tearjerker filled with a host of profound moments, strong pacing, and interesting twists. Kaim's seemingly never-ending journey as an immortal becomes the fulcrum for something grand and mature, and is propped up with decent writing. I never had an issue with how this story was presented, though I do feel some people will point to the inclusion of the 1000 Year of Dreams, which is a collection of short stories centered around Kaim's past, as a necessary item to include in the main game itself rather than just a combination of short stories that are easily missed. I personally never thought this, as I saw them as a welcome break in between its heavy-hitting narrative to just sit back and take it all in, while also aiding even more in the development of Kaim. Of course, Kaim is not the only character who shines here. The likes of Seth and Janssen are but a couple more who win over the audience, but Lost Odyssey is a game that really needs to be experienced at least once to truly appreciate its legacy. Doing so in the current age, of course, is easier said than done, but it is without question one of the highlights of that generation, a timeless classic. Next up is something a bit more modern and light-hearted to boot, in Atelier Sophie 2, which sits at an average Metacritic score of 82 out of 100. Acting as the direct sequel to the original Atelier Sophie and becoming the 4th game in the Mysterious trilogy, thus making it a tetralogy, it begins with Sophie and Blacta encountering a mysterious tree and getting sucked into the dream world of Erdeviga, a land that is stuck in a time stasis housing many residents from a host of different eras. Sophie's main goal is to find Blacta and eventually get back to her own world. And the main question I'm sure many will ask immediately, do you have to play the first game to understand this one? You don't. This is a standalone adventure with minor callbacks to the first game, which in of itself wasn't all that heavy in the story department anyway. There's not really a risk of getting lost here due to a lack of prior knowledge. However, I will say that the angle Atelier Sophie 2 goes for will be more impactful to those who have played the first game. Generally speaking though, the stories for Atelier aren't thematically deep or filled with complex world building, and it's not too different for this sequel. It certainly has a more focused story than others in the franchise, but nothing overly difficult to grasp. Rather, the strength of Sophie 2 lies with the characters themselves, who once again are great. There's plenty of fluid chemistry between the group, individual story arcs that you can pursue, and a fair amount of humorous yet solid dialogue, all feeding into decent character development. The land of Erdeviga is the setting, but it's very much the characters that take centre stage here, and they each get their moments to shine at certain points. The highlight of Sophie 2 though remains its gameplay. Alchemy is the focus of the experience, and it has a variety of mechanics that feed into its core system. There is of course a need to gather materials, but Sophie 2 aims to enrich this aspect even more than in previous games with the changing of weather. It's a driving motif in world traversal, and it not only has the potential of changing the terrain itself, meaning that previously inaccessible areas open up to the player, but it also acts as a fulcrum for puzzles. There will be many times where treasures or areas will be seemingly out of reach, and they can only be accessed via the weather changing mechanic. And since you don't get all of the options at once, it means that there's a real incentive to continually come back to areas as you unlock more. Sophie 2 also reverts to the turn-based battle system of the original Mysterious trilogy. You have 3 members on the front line and 3 members on the back line. If you build up a gauge, you'll be able to link your abilities with another member, and in addition, it will also swap them. This works really well, as it ensures switching the party in and out becomes a part of the experience itself, which is important as each of them fits a role. Some will be the damage sponge, some will buff, some will debuff, others focus on magic attacks, and so on. They're not rigid roles by any stretch, but there's a clear indication of what each character specialises in at the very least. Your time in the world will also become the main method by which you unlock further recipes, and naturally this increases the amount of items you can create through the medium of alchemy. And anyone who has played one of the original Mysterious games will feel a sense of familiarity. It's a grid-based layout split into 4 key stages. These are choosing the recipe to create, deciding on materials, laying them on the grid, and finally picking the traits on completion. Placing an item on the grid will contribute to an item's effect level. To gain these effects, you use your materials, which have their own properties. For example, a 3 square lightning component will contribute to 3 blips on all corresponding lightning effects. If you place it on a lightning symbol within the grid, that yields 1 extra blip. Pretty simple and not too dissimilar to Lydian's Suelle in that regard. Sophie 2 sets itself apart from its predecessors though with element links. Certain components will have stars that represent these links. If you place the stars next to each other on the grid, they will connect and also increase the max effect level, meaning that this is the only way to attain the higher level characteristics. This core mechanic is expanded upon with the help of the other characters. As you progress through the story, new abilities will open up specific to each member of the team, and these give you the ability to change components to their given elements, create new links, or even bring in completely new components during a synthesis. This means that you can max out, say, a lightning denominated effect and then attempt to do the same for a fire effect. Combine this with the return of the catalyst that can also be remade for beneficial characteristics, and you once again have an intuitive and deep system which is so satisfying to work with. While it is a bit slow to get going in terms of barring all mechanics from you till later on, there is no denying that when it is firing on all cylinders, it's an absolute joy to work with. Combine this with the quality of life elements like auto-synthesis for the less important items and duplication so that you can dedicate most of your time to the items you want to pursue, and this system became my second favourite to work with behind Lydian's Suelle's. Atelier Sophie 2 is what I see as a near-on flawless Atelier experience. It's got so much polish and care with an excellent protagonist at the helm. It's no surprise that Japanese fans voted Sophie as their favourite main character in several polls before the game's release. It's an Atelier game that excels in what allows the franchise to stand apart from contemporaries, that being its crafting, but also looks to improve on the aspects that the series is normally weaker in. It is my favourite game in the franchise, and will likely remain as such for many years to come as well. And speaking about my favourite game in the series, that seems a good time as any to shift over to Zemuria with Trails to Azure, which sits at a Metacritic score of 81 out of 100. It follows on from the events of Trails from Zero, which itself ended very strongly, continuing the story of Crossbell before its eventual conclusion come Trails into Reverie. Now I'll repeat what I said at the start of the video, in my eyes, no game is infallible, there is a drawback with every RPG out there. But Trails to Azure for me is one of the games that comes very close to breaking that mindset. It is my favourite in the series, if you didn't catch that 20 seconds ago, and it has remained as such since the day I played it 4 years back. No other game in the Trails series has captivated me like Azure did, and that's saying something considering how highly I regard the series overall. Take all the good stuff from Trails from Zero and dial it up a notch or two, because that is what this sequel is all about. Trails to Azure is just peak Falcom, a story that grabbed me by the augments and didn't let go all the way to the end. The pacing was masterful, there was always something going on, you could never shake the feeling that something was amiss at any given moment. The setting in Crossbell took on another dimension with the addition of the West Zemuria Trade Conference. This was a game that really demonstrated the appeal of this series in terms of its world building and political intrigue, drawing in nations from around the continent and demonstrating the cruel situation that Crossbell found itself in. It illustrated the challenge facing the SSS as they aimed to uproot the deep-seated rot that plagued their home. The fantasy element was ramped up with the involvement of even greater forces, the camaraderie between the members and their overall development was a joy. I can't come up with enough superlatives for the game. I will admit that it has a mixed bag in terms of its antagonists, some good and some bad, and it does suffer from the bonding events hiding potentially important lore behind optional scenes, but for someone like me who is more than happy to save Horde to see them all anyway, it was never really an issue. The rest of the game though is just pure Trails goodness. The characters, the sprinkling of interconnectivity, the revelations, it's perfect. I'd be a fool to admit as well that it culminates in my personal favourite moment in the series, and it still remains as such to this day as well. The ending still gives me goosebumps to this day, and no matter how many times I see it, it will continue to do so. In fact, the entire second half of the game does that, and the first half is pretty damn good too. You then add on its solid turn-based battle system, reminiscent of the Sky games, excellent side content that sometimes will feed into stories from the characters in previous games, and of course its brilliantly tight-knit group in the SSS along with other supporting members, and you've got a recipe for what is the best game in the series, one of the easiest 10 out of 10s I can think of. As is the next entry, which is also from Falcom, and it's for Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana, sitting at a Metacritic score of 85 out of 100. Now maybe it's because this is the game that reignited my love for RPGs, maybe it's because it was the first game I played in over a year, so my thought process was skewed, that is a possibility. But irrespective of that, I'm certain that if I played Ys 8 now, completely blind, I would feel exactly the same about it as I did when I first played it back in 2017. Ys 8 for me is once again one of the easiest 10 out of 10s I will ever give. It is a bona fide masterpiece and hits every target on what I look for in an action RPG. In this game, Adol is once again roaming the seas with Dogi in search of his next adventure, but as with most ships that transport the red-haired adventurer, it's cursed to sink to the briny deep. Something evidently happened after Ys 10. Adol finds himself stranded on the Isle of Seren and is thus trapped on it along with other survivors until he is able to solve the mysteries surrounding the land. Now I mentioned that Persona 5 Royal had an excellent first impression. Ys 8 though was just as good. I mean, how can you not get hyped as soon as you hear this? Moments like hearing Sunshine Coastline for the first time are the representation as to why Ys 8 is one of the greatest action RPGs ever made. I will forever remember that moment. It is a scene that I hold on to fondly even today. That feeling of leaving the camp, venturing onto the beaches and listening to the sickest riffs since Van Halen, how could I not be a fan? The exploration? Stellar. plenty to find, a host of members to bring back to your camp, which each have their own side quests for you to pursue, secrets around every corner. Issei screams adventure and then some. Combat, you get control of one character and of two others to switch between on the fly. It's fast, visceral, tight. Everything you need in an action RPG is here. It doesn't get much better than this. And then the characters and story. I get that the ending of Issei isn't to everyone's liking, but I was on board. It was a bittersweet conclusion which I think fit perfectly with the overall theme and premise of what Lacrimosa was all about. Obviously this isn't spoiler territory, so I'm not going deeper, but I was fine with it. As was I fine with the inclusion of our secondary protagonist, Dana herself. She is awesome, a dual-blade warrior priestess who takes names and can stand strong by her own principles. There is a reason that Dana continues to get merch years after the game released. There is a reason why she is getting a figure in the near future, and there is a reason why she is consistently voted the best female character in the series, even above the likes of Rhea and Fina. Dana is yet another beacon as to why this game is special, yet another feather that makes up the cap that is Ys-8. It has so many memorable moments within it, intrigue, mystery, everything that I envision the Ys series to be is on full display in this game, and it excels at it to boot. Once again, an easy 10 out of 10, near on flawless, and a must buy for any action RPG fan. Shifting over to Fire Emblem now, with Fire Emblem Awakening that sits at a Metacritic score of 92 out of 100. Now for me, it was very close between this one and Radiant Dawn, but I just had to give the slightest edge to Awakening, as it was the one that kept me playing well into the night on several occasions. Awakening is just an excellent SRPG, like I can't really say much more than that. There's a reason why it was the game that launched Fire Emblem into the stratosphere in terms of popularity, and regardless of what people may think about it, we owe a lot to the legacy of Awakening, for it is the reason the series endures to this day. Back in 2013, it was made clear in an interview that Fire Emblem during the Wii and DS era were on the decline, and Nintendo had told Intelligent Systems that if the next title failed to meet expectation, the series would be shelved indefinitely. With this in mind, Intelligent Systems had to come up with ideas that would ensure this game would be a success. It already had the potential market in terms of a massive number of 3DS owners, but it still needed to attract a wider fan base. It did this in a few ways. Though it maintained the fantasy setting that Fire Emblem was known for, it brought in the self-insert protag who was integral to the story, and the casual mode to alleviate the permadeath feature. This was arguably more important considering the translation error that occurred with the previous Western release in Radiant Dawn that had infamously managed to mess up difficulty settings. In short, those who played on normal were actually playing on hard, giving the game its notorious reputation for difficulty. The changes for Awakening were a welcome shift, and though not the first to use it, it was the first time that many in the West had experienced this accessibility on a wider scale, and it went over fairly well. Awakening also put much more importance on its interpersonal relationships between members, with private events becoming a core part of the game and a staple of the series going forward. Despite this, it maintained the core outline of what Fire Emblem was all about, meaning that the game remained strong in its strategic roots while also modernising it to make it more accessible for the average player. Of course, the rest is history. Awakening is one of the must-buys on the 3DS and sold well over 2 million copies during its lifetime. And I can definitely see why. I would be sinking so much time into Awakening I'd lose track of time on several occasions. Whether it was the world, the characters, or just the solid gameplay, Awakening was pretty much a case of the stars aligning. Everything just worked. I think the real boon for Awakening is once again in regards to those characters. It managed to make them feel like more than just a unit in an army. Whereas games of the past would often give a small backstory and then forget them completely as the narrative progressed, Awakening managed to give a host of relationships to each member that just added more to their personality and traits. The social aspect is definitely the element that I feel saved the franchise overall, and there's a reason why it's a central part of all the newer releases since. A must play for all SRPG fans, Awakening is a straight up masterpiece. And since we mentioned Masterpiece, our next one is of the same ilk. Well, to be honest, I consider all these games to be masterpieces, but anyway, it's for Nier Automata, which sits at a score of 88 out of 100. For me, this is the best game that Platinum has ever developed. Its gameplay is near on faultless. In this adventure, we join 2B and 9S in a profound journey of finding meaning in one's existence. Again, it starts off with a bang, a badass gunning section to get the heart racing before landing in an abandoned factory to fight the sentient hordes of machines. That is a top tier start. And it maintains that pace right up till the end of the segment 2 with the fight against Engels, which is still such an impressive looking battle. Multiple phases, a model that covers the entire screen. It was so good that they replicated it for an event in Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, and it was just as cool there. But after this, you awaken in the orbiting satellite of the bunker and discover what Automata is based around. Units like 2B and 9S are androids who fight on behalf of the humans stationed on the moon against the alien-created machines. Of course, this was written by Yoko Taro, so expect a little bit more than that, but I won't be sharing spoilers beyond those opening moments, for this isn't intended as a story analysis video. Soon after, you're sent back down to Earth to continue your mission, and this is where most of your time is spent. I mentioned Nier Automata in my video concerning games that nail their atmosphere, and I'll say it again. It is masterful in terms of the vibes it gives off, a dystopian world that is barely hanging on to existence in some ways, but is also attempting to find meaning once again. There's a sense that things aren't right and the world is in a time stasis of its own. It's full of mystery and questions no matter where you go, and it only gets more involved the further you get in. The theme park is the first thing I think about when looking to support this claim. How can a setting feel so harmless yet creepy at the same time? It's a great balance that Nier Automata demonstrates, and it does it all the way through. You get the impression that Automata is not going to give you its answers. It expects you to piece them together yourself and get lost in its world in order to do that. And then its OST, well, wonderful. Reminiscent of Nier Replicant and just as captivating, but with a bit more of that cyberpunk feel to it, with some bosses even melding seamlessly with the beats to create something that is more than the sum of its parts. And of course the gameplay, it's Platinum Games at their finest, with fluid and slick action-based combat. Movement feels so crisp, you feel the impact of every swing of your blade. That alone kept me hooked right to the end. But it also encompasses other genres. Certain sections will bring in shoot-'em-up elements or platforming. There's plenty to keep you on edge throughout your time as you pursue the 5 main endings. Nier Automata is probably the most attractive game to a wide array of audiences. Even non-JRPG fans will enjoy this. It's catered to such a diverse array of tastes because it not only covers so many bases, but it executes them brilliantly as well. I can't say much more than that. It is an easy 10 out of 10, one of the finest games that Square has in its portfolio. Now our next entry is an indie title, and it's from Sigono Inc. called Opus Echo of Starsong. It was between Opus and 13 Sentinels for this spot because I only wanted to include one of these on the list, as strictly speaking. They are not JRPGs, but they are games that I know JRPG fans will enjoy, especially if they place a heavy emphasis on story. In this case, Opus won out ever so slightly, but there's your bonus 11th entry, play Aegis Rim 2. As for Echo of Starsong, it sits at a Metacritic score of 90 out of 100. As said before, Opus is not a JRPG, it's more a hybrid puzzle solver, space exploration come visual novel than anything else, but a damn good one, let me add. In Opus, you'll be joining Ada, Jun and Remy in their travels around the Thousand Peaks. 70% of the time you'll ride around this vast setting in your ship, moving from node to node. Resource management is key and is split between 3 main elements: fuel, armor plate and exploration kits. Fuel is pretty much what you would expect. The further you travel, the more you consume, so there's an element of prior planning needed. Armor plates are also self-explanatory, they function as the ship's health. And the last one, exploration kits, are your method by which you can gather materials in the various nodes you visit. Progression is thus fairly simple in this game: explore, upgrade, and explore even more, all over the backdrop of a main story. Every now and then as you travel, you'll also encounter certain events that you need to overcome. The ultimate outcomes of many of these are determined by a dice roll, and this is affected by the upgrades you've made to your ship and so on. Failed rolls will generally result in lost money or armor plates, while successful rolls will either allow you to pass on unimpeded or get a unique item. As you jog around the Thousand Peaks though, you'll sometimes find schematics which lead to the so-called Lumen Caves. Upon entering one of these caves, you'll be greeted with a 2.5D perspective, and your objective is once again self-explanatory: get to the end. Level design is simple with minimal branching paths, but it is broken up with frequent puzzles in between that utilise so-called star songs to push through. Though the puzzles themselves aren't too difficult, what you will notice from these sections is the excellent sound design. The developers were so confident in it that they suggest most players wear headphones while playing the game, and I didn't regret doing that. All the choices fed into this beautiful cacophony that only added to the narrative being told, and that's very important when sound itself is a driving motif of Opus both narratively and mechanically. Props also must be given to the visual design, though the actual graphics are simple enough, the style and cinematography are just perfect for this type of game. Whether you're in an eerie, abandoned station or exploring the depths of a long-lost cave, the presentation is always on point. As a singular point then, all of these elements are quite strong, but the beauty of Opus is that all of them come together and contribute to one of the best narratives I've experienced in any game from recent memory. Sigono Inc. have shown that limited budget and limited resources do not translate into a cheap experience. It's very clear that the developers had a focus from the start for every detail within Opus feeds into the story, characters and world building. Pretty much straight away, as soon as I started the game, I was drawn in by the perspective that Opus adopted. It's nothing unique, but it's utilised to its fullest. It allowed the developers to work around that viewpoint to deliver grade A storytelling in as short a time as possible. Every node you visit or item you find will generally have flavour text, soul style, and that text will detail something relating to a character, a location, or even a planet. The world of Opus is actually quite complex. There's politics, religion, and various factions at play in the backdrop of an already tense setting. And I love storytelling like this because to me it shows that the developers have respect for the player's intelligence. They give what is needed for the main story, but it's as if they're actively saying if you want to delve in deeper and piece it all together yourself, then get out there and find it. It's a classic case of reward through efforts, and every little tidbit found just fed more into this wonderful world that the developers made, and that praise does extend to the characters too. I don't want to say too much more because I feel this is a game you should play as blind as possible, but I am once again giving it the spotlight it deserves. And it won't cost you too much to do so. It sits at around $25 for the privilege of owning on either Steam or Switch. And if you do find yourself enjoying it, there is always the first game to check out in Rocative Whispers, but it is worth noting that Sigono are also working on their next project called Opus Prison Peak. But as for Star Song, it is a fantastic story, one of the most touching I've ever experienced, and a solid 10 out of 10. Moving over to Tales now, and I'm giving the 10 out of 10 accolade to Tales of Berseria, which sits at a surprisingly low Metacritic score of 79 out of 100, but I think I know why that is. I'm personally just a sucker for a good revenge story. There's no doubt in my mind that Velvet is the shining light in this adventure, and this is also where again my preference for story over gameplay wins out. I am of the mind that the combat system for Berseria was notably more simplified compared to say Vesperia or Symphonia, but on the other hand, it is without question my favourite story in the entirety of Tales thus far. If anything, the core theme of Berseria, this idea of emotions and the meaning of being human, are illustrated brilliantly by Velvet herself, or at least the bad side of it. Velvet's character demonstrates that raw, unbridled emotion can essentially turn you into a monster, both figuratively and mentally. With her singular goal, Velvet demonstrates on many occasions in the early stages that she only cares about that mission, and she'll do anything she has to in order to make it happen, even condemning innocents to a cruel fate. While Tales games aren't always based around a happy-go-lucky atmosphere, I did feel that Berseria was notably darker than many others I had played. But there are clear moments within this narrative that show a line that Velvet will not cross. In particular, this idea of never coming between a brother-sister relationship, not in that way. Velvet herself knows all too well the pain of losing someone dear to her, and as a result there are certain moments within Berseria that force her to reflect on her own actions, as she questions whether she ultimately became the same monsters who took away her own reason for living in the first place. It's a very poignant character arc, and though Velvet never really loses that edge over the course of Berseria, she does visually develop during the adventure. She never becomes an outright hero, but she purifies this seething aura of hatred that surrounds her to become something more akin to an anti-hero, and I love that direction, as it allows Berseria to stand apart from its contemporaries. It's obviously not just Velvet as well. I think this is the best all-round cast I've experienced so far. You got a good mix of personalities that all bounce off each other well. And I will also give mention to the skits. The skits in this game are really strong, some of the best I've seen in the series to date. They just hit the right tone of what these moments are all about, giving us an ever clearer window into the personalities of this cast of characters. Sure, the dialogue can be a bit silly at points, but that's fine. These skits for me are never about being serious. They're merely ways to develop the characters further in between events. Stuff like Aizen's curse, Magalu just being Magalu, the juxtaposition between personalities of certain members and how they interact in light of that. They are really good in Berseria. Honestly, I've no doubt that many will look at my inclusion of Berseria here as a strange choice, but at the end of the day, it's my list. These are games that I consider near on flawless, and Berseria hits so many balls out of the park, I can allow it to strike out a little in regards to its gameplay, which is still pretty good anyway. The last spot on this list goes to Xenoblade, but actually choosing among the 3 numbered entries was my most difficult task. I can't consider X as I never played it when I owned a Wii U, so I'm keeping it confined to the trilogy. All of them excel in their story, characters and gameplay, but I still maintain the thoughts I had from last year. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 has the best story, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has the best gameplay, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3 doesn't have the weaknesses of the other two in regards to overly large maps for 1 and a slow build up in 2, but doesn't win out in either its story or gameplay compared to its predecessors, despite doing well in both regardless. For me, I give the crown to Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which sits at a Metacritic score of 83 out of 100. There are 2 main reasons why I give it the edge. Initially, I was absolutely hooked on its story. Despite me believing that XC1's narrative is the best in terms of its overall premise and execution, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is very close behind. I know some people weren't vibing with the story beats in this game and found it a bit silly in parts, which, yeah, it is, but I was all good with that. There was a fine balance between those heavy-hitting moments that brought a story to life, and also those light-hearted scenes that give us a deeper look into each character from a more humorous angle. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 nailed that aspect. There were countless moments where I was just smiling during my time with it. From its amazing OST to its wonderful cinematography, it had the whole package in that regard. The second reason though was indeed its gameplay. While I wasn't too big on the field skills and am personally glad they didn't return in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, I was fine with the gacha based elements of unlocking more blades, no issue with it. I dare say if I was completionist that thought process would change, but I'm not, so it didn't matter to me. That being said, the real crux of the gameplay from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is that it just got better and better as the hours passed. Initially, I wasn't impressed with it. It took a while to get going and I was worrying by chapter 3 that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was not going to appeal to my tastes, at least in terms of gameplay. But from chapter 4 onwards, it all started to come together. It felt like a gamble in that Monolith Soft put so much into its combat that it ultimately could have become its greatest downfall. Though it takes a bit of time to get going, this game has one of my favourite combat systems in any RPG. It's just so well put together and gratifying to boot, from combos to elemental orbs to bursts. I really dig the meaningful build up and eventual payoff that comes with this system, and it's ultimately because its mechanics are so intrinsically linked that it feels disjointed in the early stages, since you don't have all options available to you till later on. Once everything is there though, the system is brilliant and I loved it all the way to the end. And there's so much more. I believe that exploration is stronger in this game compared to Xenoblade Chronicles 1 or 3. The map design is more compact rather than relying on scale alone. The blades are a great addition, especially with the unique models that grant additional side content to dig deeper into their characters, leading to insane levels of value for the money you're paying. The characters, brilliant. I'm a massive fan of Rex as a protagonist. I think he's the most relatable one of the lot. He shows the most development, and of course knowing what he eventually becomes later on, wink wink, I've just got so much time for the guy. Same goes for the rest, Pyra, Mithra, Zeke, Nia. It's just such a colourful and enjoyable cast of characters from start to finish. I also hold the opinion that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has the best DLC of the 3 as well. Torna is a masterpiece in of itself, a brilliant package that adds even more to its excellent narrative. And as for that story, well, I've already given you a glimpse as to what I think about that. I have a lot of love for Xenoblade Chronicles 2. It is my personal favourite of the 3, but to be honest, any of the Xenoblade games could be on this list. Each of them is a masterpiece in my eyes, and I dare say Xenoblade Chronicles X would be exactly the same, though I myself haven't played it. But for me, I give the ever so slight edge to Xenoblade Chronicles 2 a 10 out of 10 experience from a 10 out of 10 developer. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.